It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague from the University of Minnesota. Ann Masten is a Regents Professor and Irving B. Harris Professor of Child Development at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Her research focuses on understanding processes that promote competence and prevent problems in human development. Today, Ann will share lessons that she's learned from 5 decades of research on resilience in human development, with a specific focus on the importance of early childhood for mitigating risk and promoting resilience. Ann is one of those researchers, and there are many of them, whose curiosity and persistent pursuit of knowledge helps us better understand families and the children in those families, so we can in turn serve them better. So I'm very happy to introduce Ann Masten.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here because I think this is a very important institute, and I believe that all of you are engaged in many different ways in the job of promoting resilience for the children and families of Minnesota. What I want to do today is highlight some of the things I've taken away from the research. I want to share concepts and also a general framework for thinking about the work you do from the perspective of resilience in hopes that that might guide some of your activities. So I want you to think about, before we even start here, how resilience and your efforts to promote it affect your everyday work with children or families. Because I think resilience is all around us. I see it in the work I do. I do research primarily with children and families. Recently, a lot of my research has been on homeless children and families in Minnesota. And I can go into a shelter on any given day and see resilience all around. I'm going to show you some data from our efforts to try to figure out how is it that we see resilience in families that have overcome tremendous difficulties. But I've also studied child survivors of disaster and war, and also everyday children growing up in Minnesota. And I haven't personally studied resilience for 50 years, although I did grow up in the U.S. military, so that was in a way studying resilience. I went to lived in 25 different places by the time I was 16. Maybe that's why I study resilience. Anyway, so let's get going. I want to start with a single case. The research on resilience in many ways got started from people inspired. People like you, researcher people, but people inspired by what they saw. Resilience is a phenomenon that you can see. And I want to tell you about the case of Sarah. This is not naturally occurring resilience. This is an example of intervention. And I thought that would be a good way to start today. And this is a published case, so you can read more about it if you want to. I met Sarah when she was 30 months old. She was hospitalized. I was part of a clinical team. I'm a clinical psychologist by training that was assigned to her case to try to figure out what was going on with this little girl and make a recommendation. But this is her growth chart showing it up to the time she was hospitalized. And what you can see there is that she was growing fine. This is a typical pediatric growth chart. Height's on the top, and this is her weight. Everything seemed to be going well until around 1 year of age, and then something happened, and her growth rate, oh, that's my daughter calling. Okay, we'll turn that off. If she were younger, I'd answer it, but she's grown up. She can handle the delay. So, something had gone wrong here. How could we account for this? And she was falling off the growth chart. Her height, weight, and head circumference were all below the 2nd percentile when I met her. And she also had very strange behavior. She would freeze and not talk very much. She would echo. So people had all kinds of hypotheses about her. But we learned some very important details about her history, which I'll share with you in a moment. The crucial thing for Sarah was that as a clinical team, we were asked this rather profound question. I was kind of stunned by this question by she was in the custody of the state. And they said, should she be institutionalized or should she be adopted? And I thought, wow, there's a life-altering question. And she was hospitalized in a fantastic facility that was specialized in pediatric cases and was well equipped to address both medical and psychosocial trauma issues and that sort of thing. So we basically concluded after about several weeks of assessments that this child was fine, but what she needed was adoption by a loving family that was well suited to her needs. What we discovered is that she had been in a foster care family until 1 year of age, and then her foster father died, and shortly after that, her foster mother asked Child Protection to come pick her up and move her to a new home because she was too depressed from her husband's death to take care of the foster children in the home. So this little girl was abruptly moved without any warning or preparation whatsoever from her first foster home to a second home, and she went into a developmental tailspin. There were great records on her because she was a ward of the state, and her pediatrician started worrying. The foster home had other children, but this foster home wasn't well suited to what this little girl needed. And she had been moved at the worst possible time, right in the middle of an intense attachment time period. And she did not respond well. So what we concluded was that we needed to write a prescription for a new family for this little girl. And I would invite you to think about what would be in your prescription for a child with this kind of history, to seek an adopting family. What qualities would be important. And I bet that if we had a little team here to come up with it, you would come up with a very similar prescription to the one that we had. This is Sarah's response to the intervention. She, a fantastic social worker in a large region, found what we thought was an ideal family. She basically filled the prescription to a T that we had written. This child was adopted straight out of the hospital. The family came and visited the hospital every day for 2 weeks before they took her home. And then she made a spectacular recovery across the board, behaviorally, socially, emotionally, and in her physical heightened growth. It took a little while, but very quickly she rebounded up onto a normal growth curve. I think she's a case illustration of how intervention can make a difference in promoting resilience. Well, this is my current definition of resilience: the capacity of a system to withstand or recover from significant disturbances that threaten development, adaptation, life, functioning in some way. Now, I say a system here because the notion of resilience is very general. Resilience can refer to a child, that's what I'm going to focus on here today, but it also can refer to a family. And I think the resilience of a family is critical often for the resilience of the children in that family. But there's also the resilience of communities, the resilience of schools, the resilience of caseworkers and people who try to promote resilience. Resilience is interconnected, and I want to talk a bit about that. You also probably will notice, as you think about it in the future, that people are adopting this notion of resilience across many different fields. People are talking about the resilience of the planet, for example, to global climate change. We're all hoping for resilience. People talk about the resilience of the economy. The U.S. economy showing quite a bit of resilience right now. It's recovering from the shock of the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. So it's a very broad concept. When we're talking about children, we have to define resilience in terms of two major ingredients. One is risk. What are the disturbances? And many different kinds of challenges and disturbances have been studied in this literature, and you can imagine what some of them are. At first, people studied individual risk factors like divorce, maltreatment, disaster, that sort of thing. But very quickly, people realized that often risk factors pile up in the lives of children, and I'm sure you've observed that. And that's why people use measures like ACEs. I understand you've had some training on ACEs if you've been to previous institutes. Adverse childhood experiences. Many people now measure cumulative risk. They try to capture the overall amount of adversity that a child has experienced, because the dose of adversity makes a difference. The other ingredient, though, is adaptation. What are we going to use as our measures or indicators of how well a child is doing or how well a family is doing? And people in child development research like myself have studied competence, how well are kids doing in the domains we expect children to be doing well, called developmental tasks. I'll show you those in a moment. But also people have studied symptoms as their indicator. If you're studying, the impact of war trauma, you're studying child soldiers, for example, often people are measuring something like post-traumatic stress symptoms, because that's a big indicator of how people are responding to the adversity. But I often focus on developmental tasks, and these are the benchmarks of development in terms of psychosocial development. And some of them, they're like motor milestones, but we often in psychology are focusing on how well children are forming attachment bonds with their caregiver, or how well they're behaving when they go to school, that sort of thing. And obviously, developmental tasks, what we expect children to be learning and doing as indicators of doing well, change over the course of development. So, when children are young, we look for them to learn, to form the attachment, to learn to talk, and begin to be able to control their behavior, at least well enough to get along in a little preschool setting or something like that. Once children go to school, the expectations increase. They're expected to be able to listen to the teacher, get along with the other children, and learn something while they're in school. And those are often the criteria for adaptation that researchers are looking to measure. It's also the case that when I think about resilience and development, I think about how development emerges from the interaction of many systems. And this is a very important idea in resilience now. And this is a very typical picture. From genes to environment, everything is interacting. And Ian Gottlieb used this picture a lot to show development. I think another way to look at this is to think about the way that systems are embedded in each other. So this is the child here, and this child, it has systems inside. You have a child has an immune system and a neurocognitive system, and things are happening on the inside. They have stress response systems and so forth. But children are also embedded in families, and as they get older, they're embedded in peer groups or neighborhood groups. They go to school when they get older yet, and they are part of a school system and a classroom. And each of these systems is in turn embedded in larger systems. And these systems are all interacting with each other. And this becomes very important when you think about what to do to promote resilience. Because resilience is dynamic, it's always changing. Systems are always changing. The resources, environment that children are interacting with is always changing. Families develop too. Families and children interact all the time, but each of them is developing. And the capacity for resilience is distributed across these systems that are important to the child. Resilience isn't just about what a child is walking around with on their own. An individual child's resilience depends on the resilience of their families or other people they're close to, the resilience of their schools, and so forth. And this means that resilience is also not a trait. There are many traits that may contribute to resilience, but it isn't just what you have inside of you or your personality. Resilience arises from being able to draw on many kinds of resources. And this is important to think about because many of your jobs, much of the work you do is mobilizing and generating capacity for the resilience of children and families through your activities and your job. People portray the course of adaptive functioning often as pathways that look something like this. This is a general pathway. How is, in this picture, up is good and down is bad. So, this is somebody's adaptation going along over time. And if you want to show more pathways, some of which show resilience and some of which do not, you can portray it like this. This shows different responses to a disaster, and people are measuring things like this after, for example, a tornado or a tsunami or some other traumatic event that large groups of people experience. You can follow different patterns. All the dashed line patterns here show resilience. Pattern A is often called the stress resistance pattern. These are people, children included, who do fairly well. They show a steady course of good functioning despite some sort of acute adversity, and it's interesting to think about why that might be. Pattern B is the breakdown and recovery pattern. Little Sarah showed this pattern in her life. That's a recovery pattern of resilience. Pattern C is the post-traumatic growth pattern. There's a great deal of interest in positive impacts. Not that you would expose people to trauma, but sometimes people respond to challenge and adversity by learning or changing in such a way that they transform into a higher functioning person. There's much more work on that in adults and adolescents yet than there is in young children. And then patterns D and E show people who have had been profoundly and negatively impacted by adversity, and they haven't yet recovered. That doesn't mean they won't in the future, but so far they haven't recovered on their own, perhaps, and maybe they need a significant intervention. This is immediate breakdown, and this is a delayed recovery. Some people appear to hold on for a while, and then they break down. It's like the resources get depleted. Now, there's variation in risk exposure, and this was very, very important lesson early on in resilience, that the dose of exposure matters. And these are data coming from an early study from a shelter in the Twin Cities. So we counted up risk factors. These are kind of like ACEs, but for children. Just yes or no, has a child experienced any of these listed risk factors in their life? Oops. And then we show the behavior report problems reported by either, in this case, their parents, but also by teachers. This is the child behavior checklist. Are any of you familiar with that? Can you raise your hand? A lot of you have used it, probably. On this measure, 50 is the average in the general population. Lower scores are good. If you're around 40, it's really good. If you have scores up in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, like this is the average score in the children with 4, 5, or 6 risk factors in their life, those are very high scores. They're associated with needing clinical referral for some sort of support. But that isn't the whole story, because what we observe also is that even if you go to the very highest risk category, level 5 or level 6, you'll see variation in how well kids are doing. Some kids are on the gradient. They're like those red dots there. They have a lot of problems and a lot of risk factors. But other kids we see are doing well. They are functioning at a normal level or even better than typical. And those are the children we particularly want to understand. How do we account for a child who's doing this well despite all that risk and adversity? That's the question that we're trying to answer in resilience studies. Here's a more recent example of a risk gradient, different kind. And what this shows is achievement gaps. This is longitudinal data. This is all of the test scores from the Minneapolis Public Schools over a 5-year window, so it's longitudinal data, showing individual changes over time, pooling data from 27,000 students. And what we did was break the data into 4 groups. This group on the bottom, these are the average reading test scores for the children who had experienced an episode of homelessness or were highly mobile during this time. And this is clearly a major risk indicator. The free meals group are children who are eligible for the free meals program, which is a poverty indicator, but had never been identified as homeless or highly mobile. And the dotted line group, this group here is reduced price meals. Their average is way higher than the kids on free meals. It makes a difference if your poverty is less. And then these are kids that have never been homeless and haven't been eligible for free or reduced fee lunch during this whole window. And what you can see is the dramatic differences in both where they start and how it goes over time. The homeless group starts at the 12th percentile on a national norm reference test where the average is 50th percentile. And then they're significantly lower than the kids on free lunch, who are way lower than the kids on reduced price meals. And all of these groups are way lower than the children who have never experienced these risk indicators. And those are, children that just have a more advantaged background. And what you'll notice here is the numbers of the percentage of children in the Minneapolis public schools that fell into these categories. And even the school board members were surprised by these data. When you accumulate things up, close to 14% of the children in the Minneapolis public schools in this window were flagged for McKinney-Vento benefits and met the criteria for homeless, highly mobile. Another 57% were qualified for the National School Lunch Program free meals. That's a lot of children. And 75% of the children overall in the Minneapolis public schools are falling into a poverty or homeless group. Only 25% don't, and you can see what a huge difference it makes. And you'll notice that the gap doesn't improve over time. It's stable. It's just, now, and I didn't want to show you too much data. The math data is even more alarming, but the math data shows a widening gap over time. But this is the intransigent achievement gap. Now, that would be a risk story, but now what I'm going to show you is the bottom group only, the homeless, highly mobile children, who I'm particularly interested in. And now I'm going to plot not their average score, but their individual scores. And what you can see here, this is the national average again. But what you can see here is that when you look at them as individuals and just track their individual test scores over time, you see tremendous variation in these children. And 45% of the children in this group are within the average range or better on both math and reading the entire time, for 5 years. How do we understand that kind of success compared to the children who are staying down here? The average of all the children is low because there's so many kids that are scoring very, very low on this standardized test. But there are children doing well. And what makes the difference? How is it that they're doing well? Well, the district, like many school districts in Minnesota, collects data on possible things we could look at, like attendance. Attendance matters. Homeless children don't attend school quite as consistently as other children, and that makes a difference. And we have data on earlier achievement sometimes, so we can look at that, and I'll show you one result from that. But schools don't collect the kind of data that a resilience investigator is most interested in. The most powerful protective factors. For example, what is the home life like? What is the parenting quality? And they also can't, for financial reasons, collect as much data as researchers can on things like executive function, that might predict how well the kids are doing. Well, one very important predictor we've shown is reading achievement in first grade. This is like a 1-minute test, the Gray oral reading test. And this little test in first grade is a very, very good predictor of both math and reading achievement in third grade, and also how rapidly they're going to learn later on. And it's an even better predictor for high-risk children. It looks like early achievement in reading, and I'm guessing early achievement in math would be the case too. They didn't have a measure of math, but early achievement is a very good predictor of later development. And it's more important for children that are disadvantaged. It looks like a protective factor. So getting kids off to a good start appears to be very important. Something we've been very, very interested in is executive function skills. And some of you are taking Phil Zalazzo's workshop here, who Phil and I and Stephanie Carlson collaborate in measuring and studying executive function, because there's a lot of reason to believe that this might be a very important and also a malleable predictor of doing well in school. These are the neurocognitive processes that underlie our skills to control ourselves, to control our attention, our behavior in a classroom, like listening to the teacher, sitting in the circle, all the little behaviors that you have to make it in even preschool, much less kindergarten or first grade. And these skills develop during the early years, and they're very important for those of you concerned about early childhood development and what we can do about it. There's been a lot of reasons to believe that executive function skills would be a good place to focus, because they develop very rapidly during the early childhood years. They depend heavily, of course, on brain development, but there's also evidence from resilience research that executive function skills are associated with resilience. They also are predict, school readiness. They are related to good parenting. They're related to biological measures of stress. And most importantly, the executive functions appear to respond to efforts to intervene and promote these skills before kids get into a high-stakes school environment. And I imagine Phil is talking about some of those interventions in his workshop. This is what one of our measures that we've been working on looks like, the flanker. The child has to feed the fish by pressing the button on the correct side, and they have to feed the middle fish and ignore the friends, because the friends aren't hungry. And this little test, which is computerized, is a very good indicator of being able to focus your attention. Now I'm going to show you the DCCS, the dimensional change card sort. Professor Zelazo developed this test, and we've been working on an adaptive version of it that would work better with more diverse, younger, and disadvantaged children. A lot of the measures that we've tried out don't work very well with disadvantaged children because they haven't had the kind of language background or computer background to even understand what you're asking them to do. They might have very good executive function skills, but they can't show it to you because the measures aren't designed for them. Now I want you to watch this little girl when I turn it on. She's been asked previously to sort by color, and now she's been asked to sort by shape. And what you'll see is that she's perseverating. She continues to sort by color, even though she's saying the word shape. So this is a typical issue in executive function development. And then this new computer method drops her to an easier level, just rolls into an easier level, and then you'll see that she can do it. Okay, and hopefully you can hear it well.
Yep. Shape. Shape.
She's very confident also.
Shape. 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 If it's a truck, it goes here, but if it's a star, put it there.
This is the easier version.
Here's a truck. Where does it go? If it's a truck, then put it here, but if it's a star, put it there. Here's a star. If it's a truck, then put it here, but if it's a star, then put it there. Here's a truck.
Color and shape have been separated so that it makes it more salient for her, and she's able to do it. Now, we have shown in our research that executive function skills measured while children are staying in an emergency shelter predict how well they'll do when they transfer or enter kindergarten or first grade subsequently, and it's a big effect. If you identify children, resilient group of children who are doing well across the board, academically, socially, behaviorally, and compare them to the other children who are not doing well across the board, you see these big differences on executive function scores. It's a good predictor, and we're now working with districts to use it in screening. We want to see if it's a good screening tool as well. Now, we also are interested in parenting. And one of the ways we try to assess parenting is we videotape interactions like this. And of course, by the way, all the photos and video you're seeing here today, the parents gave their permission to show you so you could see what we're up to. And this is a very brief clip, but this kind of data is coded. This is a teaching game. And I think you can experience the high quality of the relationship between this child and this mother, as well as her skills.
A carrot.
She has to give hints, and the girl has to guess.
No, it's a what?
It's a carrot when you eat carrot.
You can't see. What's potatoes, lettuce, cabbage, and carrots? They're all not fruits, but
Vegetables.
that's right.
This parent's a very good teacher. We found that high-quality parenting like that is a protective factor, which won't surprise you. If you see a parent like that, even under very high-risk adverse situations, the children often show much better academic functioning as well as emotional well-being. So there's been a lot of research. I've done some, but many other people around the world have done research trying to understand what makes a difference, what accounts for resilience. And this is what I call the short list for resilience. Many, many studies from all over the world have generated this list, and it varies a little bit with the age of the child, but these are the most important, most validated protective factors to promote resilience in the lives of very high-risk children. What's interesting about them is that they come up in all different kinds of studies. Studies of children in war zones, studies of children during divorce, many other kinds of situation. And I think there's a reason for that. These are the most fundamental protections for human development, and they reflect adaptive systems. And there are early childhood versions of all of these kind of influences. And I think there's a couple of takeaways from this kind of a list. One is that there's something very fundamental we need to have in place for children, but also that the capacity for resilience isn't just in the child, as I mentioned at the very beginning. It's spread through other systems. And some of those are social, like relationships, and some of those are cultural. They're cultural protective factors. So these are some of the adaptive systems. I can't go into detail today. That's what I talk about in my book, and there's plenty of free resources. We're going to send around a little email for you with some free resources that you can look at about resilience. But these have evolved through biological and cultural evolution because they help people adapt. They've been, people realized it. There's been selection of these adaptive systems over time. Now, early childhood is particularly important for a number of reasons. First of all, a lot of important physical development is occurring. But setting that aside, early childhood is, of course, as you all know, a period of very rapid brain development. And on top of that, early childhood is when a lot of the adaptive systems are forming. They are developing. So the adaptive systems themselves are developing in early childhood. And, it's really important to have these basic adaptive systems because they are the engines for resilience. They're also the engines for general human development. But when the going gets tough, those protective systems really, really matter. There's a tremendous capacity for resilience in children and families if these protective adaptive systems are operating well. So what can we do to promote resilience? How do you shift from what is the research telling us to how you apply it? And I'm going to have to be brief, but I'll give you some highlights of what the translational messages are. I think you can think about a resilience framework for action, and I use 5 M's here, but you could, describe it in many different ways. The study of resilience and the concepts of resilience have spread across many fields, and one of the things that's happened is a kind of profound transformation in the way we think about intervention of many different kinds. We have strength-based school counseling. Many of you probably work in interventions where they've shifted the framework to a much more positive, strength-based, focused on positive outcomes perspective. In the olden days, when I was first learning to be a clinician, it was all about, intervention was all about risk factors, reducing risk, what's wrong with this child, how can we fix this child? It was all about, it was a deficit medical model. Now the models have shifted to a much more positive model. The first piece of this is to frame positive goals, to think about and set positive outcome criteria. Secondly, to have models that accommodate positive outcomes and also positive ingredients, positive resources, positive protective factors. We have to measure the positive. That doesn't mean we don't measure the negative. It's fine to measure, what's going on in a child's life that is stressful and so forth, but it's very important to also measure the resources, assets of the child and their environment, and the protective factors. It's also important that we use some of the strategies that are coming from resilience framework, and I'll come back to those in a moment, and that we consider and remember that a child's life involves interactions with many other systems. Sometimes the best system to intervene with is not in the child, him or herself, but it's in the family or in some other system around the child. The strategies for positive change based on a resilience framework are pretty straightforward. A risk-focused strategy is to reduce the adversity exposure. If you can, it's much better to prevent premature birth or homelessness than it is to try to remedy the outcome of it. Yes, I agree. Just because resilience model doesn't mean you ignore risk and adversity. A lot of kids in our country and in our communities in Minnesota and our families, they're just overwhelmed with adversity. It's intolerable. It's way too high. And we can't ignore the fact that you have to reduce some of that toxic stress exposure to protect child development. Secondly, you can put more resources and assets in a child's life. You can boost their access to resources. A lot of the homeless families I see don't have any access to resources. Either they haven't figured it out or they got disconnected somewhere along the line. They don't have many resources in their lives, either relationships or material kinds of resources. But the third strategy is the big powerful one, and this is to harness the power of those major fundamental adaptive systems, the engines for resilience. And I've provided you, there was a handout available. I gave you 4 different versions, so you'd have different ones you might like. And I'm not going to talk about these, but there's examples in the handout, just examples of risk-focused strategies, and you can think about, in the work you do, which of your strategies are risk-focused. You're trying to prevent or reduce something. Mitigating exposure is important, because those matters. How much adversity, how much is piling up really does matter. You've got to reduce exposure. Building assets. I provided different kinds of models of building assets. It's important to build a school. In a war zone, after the war is over, it's really great to build a school. But don't ignore the fact there are landmines there. Dig up the landmines before you build the school. That's the risk plus the assets. And then there are these powerful engines of change, and I've given you examples. By far the most important protective factor in the life of a young child is having an effective caregiver. Stable, warm, structured, and so forth. And when we wanted to help Sarah, what we did was connect her. I probably won't have any other chance my whole life to do that, to connect a child to a new family. And she rallied. But what we did was we put into place the most powerful adaptive system on the planet for child development, a warm, supportive, effective family that was very stable, and she responded to that. But there are many other examples here that you can see and think about. The interventions that work, as probably you all know, are developmentally attuned, and the timing is good. They're culturally appropriate, and there's more research going on now in the domain of cultural protective factors. that I think is going to inform what we do about culture. They also focus on the positive without ignoring the negative, and they often mobilize and support very powerful adaptive systems. Worldwide, there's a movement now to have multi-generational interventions that are targeting parent or family level and child level at the same time to try to create a kind of synergy for resilience. It's very important to integrate strategies and collaborate because of the children's lives. Children's lives often, and their parents too, are filled with all kinds of different adversities. There's a very high cumulative risk, and we sometimes can't solve all of that or support the family without a multifaceted strategy. And that means we often need to work with other people, because no one person, no one sector of our human services can do it all. And I think sometimes we expect way too much of a teacher in a classroom, as if they could solve everything, when a child is, the society is neglecting the child from birth. Even a family and an effective school can't do everything. You need a lot more resources to raise children. There are windows of opportunity. The evidence is getting better on this, and you're probably learning about it in some of your workshops, particularly executive function, for example. There are windows of opportunity when plasticity is surging, where you have more flexibility and leverage for change. Early childhood is one of those. But there's also a lot of things converging in early childhood that help you change, and you can ask me more about that. I am watching my time here, so you don't have to wave anything yet. Here are some examples of early child development of malleable risks and advantages. I mean, as many of you are engaged in trying to change lives for the better, you want to know what are the malleable systems, where do you have some leverage? And it's not always obvious where that is, but early childhood, there's a lot of good opportunities where the evidence suggests that you have a lot of changeability to work with. We know that we can do something about premature birth and hunger, parenting quality. There are really fantastic evidence-based strategies for improving parenting quality. We know that access to good quality early childhood education can make a real difference. And as you've heard, there's a lot of interest in executive function skills. This is a simple model of what we're trying to do with executive function skills, just to illustrate in a model. We're trying to improve school readiness for young children. We're working in what we hope is a window of opportunity, and the evidence suggests that preschool is. And we're hoping that by doing a program, which we call Ready, Set, Go, to boost executive function skills, we can directly promote school readiness, but also establish a cognitive protective factor against risk for these children. And we've developed an intervention with multiple components, and we did it collaboratively with the help of parents guiding us from focus groups and giving us feedback, from teachers in the community who work with homeless, highly mobile, and low-income children, as well as the teachers in the lab school at the university. We have parent training sessions, which we call family fun sessions. We have developed a curriculum with Music Together to boost executive function, and we've also developed some individual coaching strategies for children. And we try to put these together to boost up the executive function skills of the child. We're still working on it, but we're very interested and we'll be out there trying to get input and trying to test this out with more and more communities around the state. So if you're interested, I hope you'll let me or Phil Zalazzo know. And we're going through this process. We have our idea of what we're trying to do, but we go through an iterative process. We try it out, we refine it, we try it out. We're trying to work on this to get with the input of parents and teachers and watching children change to see how we can improve it. And if it doesn't work, we want to change what we're doing and come up with a new theory. We measure classroom change, teacher change, but we also measure child behavior change. We can measure parenting change, and now we've begun to measure biological change. We're measuring stress hormones in hair and saliva in the children, and we're trying to measure RNA in saliva, which will indicate epigenetic change. You really would be excited if you saw behavioral change and genetic change at the same time. That'd be great. We're aiming to be practical and integrative, and we think that will work better over the long haul, and doing these little iterative experiments. And I'm just wanting to leave time for questions. I'm up to 44 minutes, by the way. I want to share very briefly the new horizons out there. What's happening that's exciting in resilience? We're in what I call the fourth wave of resilience science, and this was it's a very multiple levels, integrative wave of research where there's a large number of people now around the world studying the neurobiology of resilience, trying to figure out how does this work? How does stress get biologically embedded? How do biological protective factors work? How is either risk or protection transmitted across generations at a biological level as well as at a behavioral or social level? And what can we do if things haven't gone so well in early childhood? Could we reprogram some of these adaptive systems so they work better? And I think that's going to be very exciting. There's also, though, a lot of research on kind of moving to higher levels of systems, not within the biology, but also to look at the resilience of families, communities, and children, how they work together. And I would recommend, there's a new issue of Family Relations. It's a journal it just published, which is about how we can integrate the science of resilience and intervention at the family as well as child level. And then there's tremendous interest worldwide and growing research on cultural protective processes, which are very important, of course, because cultures differ in what they do to promote resilience within their cultural system. We're also seeing a lot of globalization emerging in many forms in work on resilience, both intervention and research. And for example, I'm involved in a forum on investing in young children globally. They put on workshops and stuff all over the world. The whole world is realizing that you have to invest in early childhood. And they're not just talking about money, that's important, but they're also talking about programs and time to get lifelong benefits to health for society and the individuals. And the humanitarian agencies have realized that they've gotten some traction on child survival, and now they raise the bar. They say, okay, there's more to this than helping children survive. We want them to flourish and thrive, and to do that, they have to start thinking about resilience. So I think there's a lot of exciting things going on out there. And so I listed here what I see as enduring take-home messages for you. And there's a much more elaborated views in papers I've written in this book I published. This was published back in last August. Resilience is common. When I call this book Ordinary Magic, I'm referring to the fact that what makes resilience possible is very common and fundamental. We can do something about it. When you see resilience and you try to understand what it is, it doesn't look to be mysterious and rare. It's common and fundamental. And what we need to do is figure out how to promote and add these important adaptive systems into the lives of children, because they're very powerful. They not only help children recover, but they protect them when they encounter future challenges. The evidence is really strong from many studies of intervention around the world that resilience can be supported and promoted. And the resilience of children depends on the resilience of families, communities, and societies. And I would also add that Minnesota, U.S., and global resilience all depend on the resilience of children in turn. They're the future. The future adaptation of our societies and our state depend on the resilience of the children now. And I would also say that these children also depend on you and the work you're doing. And I'll close there and say thank you and take some questions. I have. We followed, in the publication, we followed her to around it was like until she was in elementary school, so you can see the outcome there. But I've stayed in touch with this family, and Sarah grew up into a perfectly ordinary teenager and now young adult. And I do think that Sarah carries some vulnerability from the loss earlier on. I don't think she's, invulnerable. I think Sarah had some vulnerability. I think she was a sensitive person, but that helped her. Nowadays, we would call that sensitivity to context or differential susceptibility. I think she was a sensitive person, but she was sensitive to the catastrophe of losing her caregivers, but she was also sensitive to a positive, high-quality environment. But I do think it would be, her family, they did want, one of the ingredients we wanted was a stable family. And we wanted experienced parents, two-parent family. We wanted a stay-at-home parent. She couldn't tolerate initially going to daycare, we didn't think. And we wanted a family with older children, but nobody to compete with her at a very young age. That was one of the problems in the second foster home. There were too many other little children, and she needed a lot of care. Anyway, that family still lives in the same home they lived in a long time ago, and I think Sarah is approximately 30 years old now. This was a while ago, yeah. But I followed the family, and of course that's a pseudonym, but yes?
I'm interested, because you said that there's a lot of work going on in cultural protective factors and promoting how this promotes resilience.
Yeah, just in terms of timing, if you were free next week, you could go to Halifax. There's a fantastic conference next week called Pathways to Resilience 3. They hold this conference every 5 years, but you can go online to the Resilience Research Center in Halifax, and that's their specialty. They have done research all over the world on cultural processes in resilience in two different ways. One, is it really true that there are some common protective factors that do appear to be some that kind of cross culture? But there's also unique cultural protective factors. Many cultures have distinct rituals. For example, there's great studies of native cultures both in Africa for child soldiers and in Canada for First Nation families, where they have cultural traditions of either ritual cleansing or forgiveness that are very important for helping reintegrate a child soldier into a community. And so there's more and more research on this, but if you went to the Resilience Research Center, they have a lot of resources there about the work they do, but it's headed by Michael Unger, who's published books on edited books with a bunch of different authors who are doing cultural research on resilience. It took a long time to get there. When in the early reviews written by me and other people, everybody would end the review saying, we should have more research on cultural processes because we know that is important. But it's not easy to do. And what's facilitated cross-cultural and kind of teams of people around the world is we now have this easy access. We can communicate with each other through Skype. You don't have to go everywhere. You can work with researchers in a local community and train them, and they can collect the data and report back. I also wanted to mention that I periodically teach a MOOC. That's one of those mass online courses for Coursera. It's called Resilience in Children. It's, global perspectives. And I put the link into the resources that'll be sent to you so that if the next edition comes up, I hope to teach it again sometime in the coming year. But it's been fascinating. It's a 6 weeks, it's with short videos, typical MOOC. But I'd like to do a version for continuing education credits. And what's fascinating is the people who take it. There are discussion forums in a MOOC, and people post messages to each other and answer questions. And last 2 times I did this, there were people from 170 different countries participating. Many of them professionals doing work very similar to the work you do. Some work for NGOs, some work for schools, some were physicians or nurses. I mean, it was an incredible experience to read to see the dialogue among people from all over the world. And one of the things we discussed was the short list. Like, is that really, does this make sense in your culture? And there was an overwhelming consensus that it did. But what varied from culture to culture was the way in which this particular protective factor manifested. Cultures vary. And like, what's good quality parenting will be influenced by culture and the context that you're talking about. So, but I would recommend looking at Michael Unger's center, because it's probably the leading center in the world for gathering up and doing research on culture. Is that a question? Yeah.
Based on your slide from Minneapolis Public Schools, that reading score from 2005-2009, and looking at the really sad results from the HHM, I'm thinking that as a Part C early interventionist, I'm feeling like those kids, we should just be making auto-eligible, that anybody that's HHM should be a part of the Part C system, just looking at the reading scores.
Well, they're at least trying to do that in early childhood. But I testified to the legislature this year to try to, I think there are other people who would agree with you that are trying to get some sort of automatic eligibility. The problem we see in the shelter is that the kids, there's so much mobility that before they get, if you do some sort of screening, first of all, they may not be there when you're screening, but then you get screened and say, oh my goodness, we need some services here, but by the time the services happen or the referral happens, they've moved again. So what we see is kids falling through the cracks. And I personally think automatic eligibility would be helpful just to speed things up in our bureaucracies. So I would agree with that. One more, you get to be the last question, I think.
Is there a lot of active research going on in a preschool setting in public schools on these executive functions?
More and more. I think we're on the brink of a lot more. But yes, Stephanie Carlson and Phil Zalazo are experts on preschool executive function and intervention. I collaborate with them. I'm particularly focused on and interested in very high-risk kids like homeless, highly mobile children. But yes, more and more. But I think we're going to see more as it really is sinking in that this is a window of opportunity to alter development in a positive direction. Lots of things converge to not only facilitate change, but to have a big impact. We call it cascading effects. If you change something in preschool, if you improve a child's behavior and conduct because they have better self-regulation skills, they get off to a little bit better start in school, they connect with teachers, you can create a kind of a positive snowball effect that can echo through in a positive way. What's really concerning to me is that a lot of the kids we see in shelters, little ones, some of them have missed completely any kind of preschool. They're not ready for school, they go to kindergarten, and they crash in the first 2 or 3 days. And helping them get back on their feet is very, very important, very, very challenging. So now, the question is, how early is early enough? You can back up to the previous generation. I mean, we're learning that the trauma a young person experiences can be transmitted, affects the biology of a future mother. So, certainly from conception, but even probably before. And in the resources I provided for you, there's some video material on some of those ideas too. Thanks a lot.